Under the sun-baked streets of 1960s Bensonhurst, the city blocks could have been anywhere, except for the Italian family restaurants, the Baptist meat market on one corner, and a bar with sawdust on the floor on the next. The Gambino crime family, one of New York's notorious 5 families, held much of the neighborhood in its sway. Nicholas Mormando and Michael DeBatte cut their teeth here, in a community still mostly hard-working Italians. Mormando was the eldest child of Italian immigrants. His father worked on the docks, his mother in a dress factory. But as a boy, he watched his father fall ill, and by age 20, he was already helping raise a younger brother and sister after losing his father to tuberculosis. In many ways, these boys learned early on that loyalty, courage, and a cool head could be what kept a family together. They joined a youth gang called the Rampers, also known as the 69th Street Boys, that ran wild on bicycles and old sedans, tearing through stoops and striking poses as mini gangsters. It was here, amidst the corner candy stores and parked Teamsters trucks, that 2 boys first learned the habits that would eventually lead them into the mob's shadowed world. In those days, small transgressions, like jumping turnstiles or stealing pocket change, seemed thrilling to a teenager. Nicky, tall and quick-witted, wore cowboy boots and an attitude as if every street corner was his personal territory. He and Mike were from families with roots in southern Italy, talking a mix of Neapolitan dialect and American slang. They were young mobsters in training, in a sense. They hung out with tougher kids who had nicknames, and even played war games with BB guns in the parks. They heard stories of Carlo Gambino's wealth and Paul Castellano's power, imagining that one day they could climb to those heights. The neighborhood was full of gamblers, policemen, and construction sites, a daily campus for learning the street code. After high school, Nicky drifted in and out of jail for petty crimes, but the real attraction for him was the lure of the Mafia. Gravano's world was one of whispered loyalty and silent deal-making, and for Mormando and DeBatte, it was a thrill. Gravano himself was only a few years older, but already a made man, the embodiment of what they aspired to. Nicky and Mike were too young and of mixed parentage to ever become made themselves, but they became associates in Gravano's crew, men who did the dirty work without ever touching the ritual of the blood oath. In this context, they felt unstoppable. To them, obeying Gravano's orders meant they had a purpose, a direction. Every beating meted out to enemies or rival dealers was a lesson in their education. In Bensonhurst bars and the back rooms of Italian delis, they heard every unsolved hit whispered as if it were normal business, and they knew one day they might be the ones shooting or lying dead. On a typical day, Nicky woke early and lit a cigar, scanning the Brooklyn newspaper for union job notices or faces he recognized. By mid-morning, he might swing by the Right Spot Deli on 86th Street for bacon, egg, and cheese, paying with a fistful of bills. By lunchtime, he was usually at the social club on Bay Ridge Parkway, where Sammy Gravano held court over black coffee. There, under the hum of a jukebox, the crew briefed him on who owed what, with Gravano dispensing nods of approval and steady voices filling the room. By afternoon, Nicky's role was clear: collect money, solve disputes, and above all, stay alert. He often said he worked as a courier for pay, delivering messages that might have resulted in violence had he acted them out personally. Mike's day often started on the 7 train, heading towards Manhattan, or at a Brooklyn wholesale market helping unload fish crates with friends. By 10 a.m., he might be in the office for their lawful side business, an accounting front for Gravano's loan sharks. Lunchtime often meant working behind the counter at Tully's restaurant, where he served his own patrons and then cleaned up alongside Rosanna. In the evening, Mike slipped back into the neighborhood, perhaps playing catch with his boys on a quiet stoop in Canarsie, or cracking jokes at the counter back at Tully's to hide his worries. He insisted his family never see the dark side of his life, but they sensed something was off. Still, at home Mike was dad and husband before anything else. Rosanna later recalled that Mike could make them all laugh with a silly dance or story, making them forget their troubles, even if just for a while. Neither man had a traditional family holding them in check. Nicky never married. Some cousins say he once courted a schoolteacher, but his lifestyle on the edge was too much for any woman. By the time he was 30, he was fully immersed in the mob life, with no wife or children of his own. Instead, he was known as a playboy who moved through the neighborhood with confidence, dating wherever he pleased, but never settling down. Mike was a very different case. He had a wife, Rosanna, and 4 young children, a daughter and 3 sons. At home on St. John's Place, Mike was daddy first. On Sundays, they all went to church together, and Mike coached his boys' little league team. He would tuck his kids into bed with lullabies and promise to come home. But he also left black cars outside school functions, and sometimes his sons would see men whispering to him in the street. He trusted that her prayers and his footsteps behind would keep them safe. Rosanna later said that Mike hid his worries as best he could, but in hindsight, realized how many nights he had walked in silence at the front door. Despite their service, neither Mormando nor Debat was ever inducted into the Mafia. Gambino rules required pure Italian lineage for induction, and both men had ancestry outside those lines. They remained associates, however much Gravano treated them like family. This meant they could never argue the chain of command or attend the boss's meetings. They did the dangerous work, but got none of the privileges of made men. Gravano once told investigators that being on the fringes made them look like wild cards, dangerous, unpredictable, and ultimately expendable if needed. They could take hits, stab furniture or foes if ordered, but as non-Italian associates, they had no vote in anything. In a sense, it freed them to act on instinct, but it also left them ultimately vulnerable, a pair of forgotten generals in a battalion. Beneath the surface of everyday life, violence was always a fact of life. In June 1982, Mormando took part in one of the most notorious episodes of the era, the unsanctioned murder of Frank Fiala, also known as Frank Sinatra, at the Plaza Suite Club on Bay Parkway. Gravano had ordered a hit on Fiala, a drug dealer who was encroaching on Gambino territory, and Nicky, armed with a shotgun, parked down the block, ready to cover the gunman. When the shots rang out, he watched the targeted men fall to the sidewalk. Then, as the killers slipped away in darkness, Nicky and his companions calmly drove back to regroup. Gravano himself would later call it a beautiful piece of work, words that would only stoke the fury of the family's leadership. The brazen slaying at a crowded Brooklyn nightclub sent shockwaves through the Mafia. Paul Castellano himself was furious that so many bullets flew out in public, exposing the family. For Nicky and the crew, the night felt like power, until they realized just how closely the boss was watching. By 1985, the rules were changing. In December of that year, John Gotti seized power by gunning down boss Paul Castellano in Manhattan. With Gotti now in charge, the crew felt new freedoms and new threats. Gravano himself had been elevated to underboss of the family, a position second only to Gotti, and Mormando was one of his most trusted soldiers. Yet with each killing, the Mafia's iron code weighed heavily on Nicky's conscience, though he'd never admit it. He learned to hold an aggressive smile in one moment and a lethal scowl the next, as if he were living 2 lives. Friends recalled how Nicky used humor to mask fear. One night, he even told Gravano he was tired of being lucky, a cryptic joke that Gravano dismissed with a slap on the back, but Gravano would remember it when Nicky's luck ran out. He truly lived up to the nickname Nicky Cowboy. He was often spotted wearing a fringe jacket and a beat-up Stetson hat, as if he'd just galloped off a ranch. This bravado camouflaged something else, a quiet anger from childhood that he never fully explained. People in the crew remember he often struggled to read or write, masking it with toughness. Men recalled how he'd look at a lamppost and mutter, "Yeah, I could fix that if someone needed a lesson." He used old country songs to sharpen his focus, Sometimes he'd hum "My Rifle, My Pony and Me" before a hit, a weird ritual that made him grin. In dim parking lots at midnight, he would eye sleek muscle cars and circle like a predator. He had a rule: never shoot if he could just as quickly disarm with words. It saved ammo, and no one expected it from him. In the mid-1980s, something changed for Nicky. Crack cocaine pulled him under. Already hooked on cocaine, he crossed the line into the newer drug that hit faster and burned out harder. Gravano watched as Nicky became withdrawn, spending long hours alone in the country farmhouse Gravano had built, muttering about snakes in the grass. The life he once carried with swagger began to erode. The steady-headed boy-turned-man was no more. Old friends said he started lurking in corners and growing fearful, as if he expected the bullets of the mob to come for him any night. A man who had once boasted about how easy it was to kill his enemies started to flinch at shadows. Nicky's last day began like any other, with a false promise. Gravano summoned him to a party at Tally's restaurant in Bensonhurst, a place Nicky considered a second home because he had often been on guard there when Gravano hosted gatherings. The invitation came with assurances of safety and respect, and Nicky came in heavy boots and leather jacket, loading a shotgun in the trunk as always. As they drove to the meeting, Gravano himself was calm, casually talking about a future business venture. Nicky smiled and chatted about finishing his basement with bragging laughter. He was oblivious. When his car reached the corner of Bay Parkway, Gravano quietly slipped out. Joseph "Old Man" Peruta, Gravano's longtime friend and a fellow Mafia soldier, climbed into the back seat in his place. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, without warning, Peruta raised a pistol and fired twice. One bullet tore through Nicky's neck, and the next through the base of his skull. The Chevy lurched, but no alarms blared. It was January 1986. Peruta dumped Nicky's limp body behind a row of trash cans in Sheepshed Bay, leaving his wallet and a pair of blood-stained cowboy boots as eerie evidence. Children who found the boots days later whispered about the cowboy ghost, but the family said nothing. Gravano later testified that he called it necessary to remove the risk Nicky had become. For years, his murder was a mystery. Mormando was only 41, and no one in town suspected how close to home his death had come. No witnesses came forward, and the press had only rumors. It was only in the early 1990s, when Sammy Gravano became a government witness, that the truth emerged. Gravano himself admitted ordering Nicky's execution. In court, he recounted how he told Nicky it was just another run and had him step aside so Peruta could strike. That confession finally tied the unsolved Bronx shooting to Bensonhurst, solving a cold case. By the time those revelations came, it was too late for Nicky to hear them. By early 1987, both Mormando and DeBat were gone. The Gambino family had taken them and moved on. Their fates were sealed by the same brutal logic they had sworn to obey. The authorities initially treated both cases as routine gangland killings without leads. In 1986, when Nicky's body was found in a vacant lot, police wrote it off as another mob hit and quickly closed the file for lack of evidence. When Michael was gunned down a year later, it was staged as a robbery in front of witnesses, throwing investigators off. For years, nobody connected the two murders. Only in the early 1990s, when Sammy Gravano turned government witness, did the FBI reopen both cases. Gravano's later testimony tied Nicky's and Michael's fates together in the Gambino saga. But by then, the neighborhood had changed, and those tragedies had become whispers of mob lore, known only to older mobsters and to federal agents compiling case files. Meanwhile, in Queens, a new story was unfolding. At age 12, Ronnie Truchio was struck by a car that shattered the bones in his right arm. He lay in the hospital as surgeons worked to save it, but when they finished, it was left crippled and fused to his shoulder. Doctors warned he might never use it, but young Ronnie proved them wrong. He learned to write with his left hand and to do everything else one-handed, turning a setback into part of his legend. He drifted into trouble as a teenager. In those Queens neighborhoods, young men played cards, ran numbers, and dreamed of fast money. Ronnie found mentors among local mobsters who saw that sharp glint in his eye. The story goes that he first impressed older capos by working security at a mob social club. When a drunk customer started acting up, Ronnie calmly picked the man up and carried him out by his collar using only his strong arm. He never missed a step. Soon a gambino capo like Anthony Tony Lee Guerrieri was recruiting him, passing him lessons in the Mafia way. Never look an elder in the eye, always stick to your story, and protect the family above all. It was a different world than Bensonhurst, but the rules of the mob stayed the same. By the early 1990s, with John Gotti Sr. behind bars awaiting trial, Gambino power was fractured. Boss William Fat Willie was supposed to run things, but in reality, Gotti Jr. had a faction in Florida and Peter Gotti rose in New York. Ronnie rode both waves. He was officially made in 1992, a full-fledged Kappa regime, and was given command of the old Ozone Park crew. His group took on the titles Ozone Park Boys or the Liberty Posse, youthful names they claimed with pride. What united them was money, lawless bets, tunnel vision on profits, and a loyalty oath to obey orders without question. Truchio's crew eventually grossed an astonishing sum, reportedly tens of millions of dollars a year. They had offices in unmarked basements, decorated with yellowed payslips and handheld radios. Every Sunday, parking lots at local bowling alleys filled with bettors scanning NFL lines. Bookies would walk into diners and write down wagers on napkins, taking 10% cuts. By some estimates, Ronnie's ring took in millions per year. He even tried to go legitimate. He leased an Italian restaurant on Liberty Avenue that allegedly took in $6.5 million a year before the taxman moved in. That corner shop was a perfect cover, busy with customers, but with marked bills flying under the table. If cops ever asked, he'd smile and say, "It's just family business," and they'd look the other way. With that kind of money flowing, it was impossible to remain completely hidden. To the FBI in the late 90s, he was a big fish. Investigative reports describe Ronnie as driving a silver Cadillac, wearing suits that could cost more than a young man's mortgage, and counting wads of cash even at home. He was said to keep those bills wrapped in rubber bands in the safe of his childhood home, in case the banks ever closed. Jokes among cops said he looked like someone who stepped off the pages of a Scorsese script. But Ronnie was careful to keep just enough distance. He never got arrested in that period, and his money never turned up suspiciously in bank accounts. He spent it in hard-to-trace casinos or pools. And yet, all leaders in that world share the same fate. Ronnie still had to learn its final lesson. In October 1995, 2 of his own men were found executed in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. A teenage mob associate and a nightclub bouncer, both victims of contract hits. The word on the street was that they had been skimming profits from a big sports book and refused to pay their share. It was widely suspected that Ronnie ordered those hits, a deadly message from Gambino leadership. To the layman, it might have seemed random, but within the family, it sent a chilling warning. No syndicate took kindly to betrayal, even from one of their own up-and-comers. Finally, the law closed in on Truchio. On December 9, 2002, federal and state authorities announced an indictment targeting Ronnie Truchio and many of his crew. In Brooklyn, they charged him with gambling, enterprise corruption, and even money laundering in connection with running slot machines and taking bets out of Ozone Park. It was a comprehensive case, and Ronnie became the face of it. He pleaded guilty to lesser state charges and even got a short sentence, but that was only the beginning. But federal agents were just warming up. On December 4, 2003, another indictment unsealed in Tampa charged Truchio with murder and racketeering in the Florida killings from 1995, as well as related armed robberies and an arson. Now he really had reason to worry. He pleaded not guilty in federal court, painting himself as a businessman at worst. But after a long trial in August 2005, the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty of RICO conspiracy to commit murder in Florida. On October 29, 2005, the judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison, the first major blow in his downfall. The saga continued. In December 2006, Truchio faced yet another trial, this time in Tampa, for separate racketeering charges. Prosecutors proved that during the early 2000s, he had used the threat of violence to impose himself on parking valet companies at hospitals and clubs, taking their business. Witnesses testified how massage therapists and partygoers would sometimes watch men in masks smash cars to force owners to obey Truchio's orders. He was convicted again in December, and in March 2007, a judge declared that Ronnie One Arm would spend the rest of his life behind bars. So what became of Ronnie was no sudden execution, but a slow, suffocating captivity. He was shipped off to maximum security facilities, eventually serving at USP Lewisburg. His crew was scattered or flipped. No Gambino soldier ever received an order to kill Ronnie. The old system no longer needed to do so. Instead, the federal courts had done it for them. By 2011, he was listed at Lewisburg with a life sentence. The media ceased covering him except as a historical footnote. The man once rumored to outrun bullets was now just another name in the filings. In portrait, all three men would look grimly stoic. Nicholas Nicky Cowboy Mormando, Michael Big Mike DeBatt, and Ronnie One Arm Truchio, each in the prime of their strength. The first two had died violently at ages 41 and 38 at the hands of men they had called friends. The third, a generation younger, would live into his 60s behind bars. Each had risen through the ranks of the Gambino family, Nicky and Mike as associates under Sammy Gravano, and Ronnie as a full capo under Gotti Jr. Each followed orders without question until, inevitably, they were outlived by those orders themselves. As the Gambino family itself splintered and declined, these men remained testament to its reach. Carlo Gambino had founded it in the 1930s, and by the 70s, Paul Castellano and then John Gotti had made it fabulously wealthy, infiltrating unions, construction, and even New Jersey's airports. But by the early 90s, after the commission trial and the fall of the old guards, it was not the force it once was. Through it all, members like Mormando, DeBatt, and Truchio were thought to be invisible, small cogs in a large machine, until federal indictments exposed them as the machine's hands and guns. The structure was clear. Orders came down from the boss, money and service went up, and in between were foot soldiers who were supposed to obey without thinking. They knew that omertà demanded silence, but they also knew the worst sin was to be suspected a snitch. Across Bensonhurst and Ozone Park today, the world looks quietly modern. Tully's restaurant still stands, but it's called Danza's now, a bright Italian eatery where no bullet holes mar the walls. The Plaza Suite Disco has long since been converted into an auto shop. Concrete mixers still rumble down these streets, but now under legitimate contracts. In Bensonhurst, one old-timer once remarked, "The joke was the mob kept the neighborhood safe by just killing off their own." It wasn't funny, but it captured a truth. When Nicky and Mike fell, it happened inside the family, leaving everyone else undisturbed, for better or worse. And the men who once stalked these blocks are mostly ghosts now. One ended with a bullet in a vacant lot, another with a bullet behind a bar, and the last with the slow death of confinement. Their era is over, but in the quiet alleys and old parish halls, their stories echo. Perhaps you might hear them in a Bensonhurst playground that still calls itself the 69th Street Boys, or in the footnotes of FBI transcripts filed away. These were no kingpins of legend, just foot soldiers who rose and fell. Yet in the city's history they mark an age. Two killed by the code they lived by, one broken by the law that replaced it. For every flashy headline about a mob trial or a Don's indictment, there were dozens more endings like theirs, unwitnessed and uncelebrated. And so we end our scene in silence, under a lone street lamp far from the bustle. The Gambino empire has crumbled, but in the quiet night, its ghosts still drift through the city, as immutable as memory. John Edward Alite was born on September 30th, 1962, in Queens, New York, into a working-class Albanian-American family. His parents had immigrated from Albania and raised their children in the Woodhaven section of Queens, a neighborhood known for its mix of ethnic groups, and during the 1960s and 1970s, a proximity to organized crime activity centered in nearby Ozone Park and Howard Beach. He grew up surrounded by the mythology of local gangsters. Social clubs and corner bars often served as informal headquarters for figures associated with the Gambino crime family. Those early impressions shaped his sense of opportunity and survival. By his teens, Alite had developed a reputation for toughness and athletic ability. He attended Richmond Hill High School, where he was known as a baseball player. Although he later claimed to have received a scholarship offer from the University of Miami, he instead drifted towards street life. His early offenses included assaults, small-scale thefts, and gambling-related disputes. These activities drew the attention of neighborhood bookmakers and minor enforcers connected to the Gambino network. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, he established contacts with associates of John Gotti, who at that time was rising through the ranks of the family's Bergin crew. Alite was not of Italian descent and therefore ineligible to become a made man within the Cosa Nostra structure. Nonetheless, he gained status as a trusted associate. His street reputation for collecting debts and handling violence efficiently made him valuable. According to later court testimony, by the mid-1980s he was working under Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti Jr., often as an enforcer in gambling and loan sharking operations. Federal investigators would eventually describe him as one of several non-Italian specialists who operated around the Gotti faction, performing enforcement work and managing off-the-books profits that could not be formally recorded within the Gambino hierarchy. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Alite participated in a range of crimes typical of the New York underworld at the time: bookmaking, extortion, illegal gambling, and fencing of stolen goods. He later acknowledged involvement in violent assaults and shootings carried out on behalf of the organization. Law enforcement reports linked him to various Queens and Brooklyn-based rackets, but rarely produced sufficient evidence for prosecution. The early years of his criminal career coincided with the height of the Gotti era, when John Gotti Sr.'s flamboyant leadership made the Gambino family the most publicized mafia organization in America. Alite remained at the lower but profitable tier of that empire, earning money through neighborhood control and protection schemes. By the early 1990s, Alite's association with John A. Jr. Gotti, the boss's son, had deepened. The younger Gotti sought to cultivate loyal crews outside the traditional Italian circle, relying on men who would operate aggressively but maintain discretion. Alite fit the profile. Federal agents later described him as Junior Gotti's point man for enforcement and debt collection in Queens and later in Florida. He also functioned as a courier for cash between gambling operations and legitimate front businesses. Around 1995, Alite relocated part of his activity to Tampa, Florida, where the Gambino family had expanded into horse racing and sports betting enterprises. Working with Gambino associate Ronnie Truchio, he managed crews that handled bookmaking, loan sharking, and insurance fraud. The operation generated substantial revenue, but also attracted federal attention. By 1998, the FBI had recorded numerous conversations implicating members of the group in extortion and violent threats. Indictments were being prepared against Truchio and his subordinates, including Alite. At the same time, tensions emerged between Alite and John Gotti Jr. According to testimony later presented in court, disagreements over money and personal loyalty led to hostility. Alite claimed that Gotti's associates attempted to lure him into a trap. The Gotti side maintained that Alite had overstepped authority and could not be trusted. Whatever the details, Alite left New York abruptly around 1999 and based himself primarily in Florida. Within a few years, he was considered by the FBI to be a fugitive from multiple pending investigations. In 2004, federal prosecutors in Tampa unsealed a broad racketeering indictment naming Alite and others as participants in a violent enterprise linked to the Gambino family. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, robbery, and racketeering. By that time, Alite had fled the United States. He traveled through several countries before settling in Brazil, where he lived under assumed identities. His flight coincided with the government's increasing use of the RICO statute against organized crime networks, and he became one of the more sought-after fugitives connected to the Gotti faction. In 2006, Brazilian authorities, acting on an Interpol warrant, arrested Alite in Rio de Janeiro. He was held for nearly 2 years while American prosecutors pursued extradition. During his detention, he was questioned by both Brazilian and US agents. In 2007, he agreed to return voluntarily to the United States, arriving in 2008 to face the racketeering indictment in the Middle District of Florida. The case alleged his participation in multiple murders and assaults carried out between 1988 and 2003, including the killings of George Grosser, Louis Dorval, and others associated with rival or delinquent gamblers. Faced with extensive evidence, including cooperating witness testimony and recorded statements, Alite chose to cooperate with federal prosecutors. In 2008, he entered into a plea agreement, admitting participation in a criminal enterprise responsible for extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and multiple acts of violence. His cooperation became a major development in the continuing series of cases against John Gotti Jr. and related defendants. In statements to investigators and during later court appearances, Alite described in detail the functioning of the Gambino hierarchy during the Gotti years. He testified that he had collected payments, delivered messages, and participated in enforcement actions under Junior Gotti's authority. His testimony was used in several prosecutions, including the 2009 racketeering trial of Gotti Jr. in New York. That case ended in a mistrial after jurors failed to reach a unanimous verdict, and federal prosecutors ultimately declined to retry Gotti. Nonetheless, Alite's cooperation provided the government with an insider's perspective on the late 20th century operations of the family. As part of his plea agreement, he was sentenced in 2011 to 10 years in federal prison, a term reduced by credit for time served and his assistance. He served most of the sentence at a low-security facility and was released in 2012. His cooperation made him a controversial figure in underworld circles. Former associates labeled him a traitor, while prosecutors portrayed him as a significant witness whose information helped clarify decades of Gambino activity. After his release, John Alite attempted to reinvent himself as a public speaker and author. He participated in media interviews discussing organized crime, cooperation with law enforcement, and personal change. In 2015, he co-authored Gotti's Rules, the story of John Alite, Junior Gotti, and the demise of the American Mafia, with journalist George Anastasia. The book presented his version of events, emphasizing his view that organized crime had lost its traditional codes, and that his decision to cooperate was a response to betrayal by former allies. While critics questioned the accuracy of some accounts, the book attracted attention for its detailed description of the mechanics of street-level racketeering. Alite also appeared in television documentaries and podcasts examining the decline of the New York Mafia. He presented himself as both participant and critic, arguing that the cultural romanticism surrounding figures like the Gottis misrepresented the violence and instability of the lifestyle. In interviews, he often repeated a core message that loyalty in organized crime was illusory and that younger people should avoid the path he chose. Despite his cooperation, Alite's testimony continued to be debated in law enforcement and journalistic circles. Some prosecutors credited him with valuable intelligence that corroborated other sources. Others regarded his accounts as self-serving. Junior Gotti publicly disputed Alite's statements, calling him a liar and opportunist. You're watching the Everything Network. On the night of April 13, 1991, the quiet block in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, looked like any other middle-class corner of the city. The kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars and kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalk. But in the driveway of one brick house sat a 1991 Lincoln Town Car that belonged to a man whose life had been tied to violence for decades. That man was Bartolomeo Bobby Boreello, a maid soldier in the Gambino crime family, a trusted bodyguard and enforcer for John Gotti throughout the boss's high-profile heyday in the 1980s. As he stepped toward his car that evening, the long arc of his life in South Brooklyn mob culture, from Gallo enforcer to feared hitter, from Colombo associate to Gambino power, ended in a brief, brutal burst of gunfire, 2 shots to the head and 5 more into his torso, leaving him dying in the street beside the Lincoln while his wife Susan and their 2 young children remained inside the house, unaware that the war he had helped wage across New York's underworld had finally come home to their front yard. To understand how Boreello reached that driveway, the story begins in South Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where 3 of New York's 5 families, the Gambino, Genovese, and Colombo organizations, were simply part of the landscape. From a young age, he was surrounded by wise guys, absorbing the codes, the swagger, and the possibilities that came with organized crime. His older brother Stevie moved in the orbit of Crazy Joe Gallo and his brothers, Albert Gallo and Frank Iliano, and Stevie's role in securing the Gallo crew's South Brooklyn rackets helped open the door for Bobby to enter that same world. A big kid from the start, Bobby quickly earned a reputation as muscle, an enforcer for the Gallo outfit, a man other men called when they wanted someone frightened, hurt, or gone. Between 1967 and 1972, his rap sheet reflected that role. At least 6 arrests on charges ranging from weapons possession and assault to larceny, gambling, and the other routine street crimes that came with that life. Yet, he consistently avoided serious prison time, a pattern that reflected both his growing usefulness to powerful mob figures and the political connections those figures wielded on his behalf. As the Gallo crew fractured after Joey Gallo's murder in 1972, the South Brooklyn rackets shifted and Bobby moved with them, transitioning from the Gallo orbit and the Colombo crime family toward the Gambinos, who were consolidating influence in trucking, construction, and waterfront industries. By the 1980s, amid the era of RICO indictments and wiretaps, he had become a made man in the Gambino family, officially inducted on December 24, 1988. On that night, he was brought to a modest Mulberry Street apartment in Little Italy, property belonging to the mother of Joseph Corrao, where several prospective inductees waited. Among them, John Gotti Jr., Dominic Pizzonia, and Nicholas Lasorsa. In that cramped room stood captains John D'Amico and Gene Gotti. Seated at the table, administering the oath, were underboss Sammy Gravano and Pasquale Conte. It was a ceremony designed to legitimize not only Bobby's membership, but also the elevation of Gotti's own son, allowing John Gotti to avoid the appearance of favoring his bloodline by having his boy inducted alongside other respected figures such as Boreello and Mikey Scars de Leonardo. In the years that followed, Boreello's role inside the Gambinos expanded, and his personal closeness to the Gotti inner circle became obvious. He developed strong ties with John Gotti himself, with Gravano, and with Nicholas and Jojo Carozzo, often spending weekends on Long Island in a mix of business and pleasure, gambling, partying, and attending performances, including shows by singer Jay Black, a childhood friend of Gotti. His home base in Brooklyn was a network of social clubs, a Carroll Gardens spot he owned, run by his brother Stevie, and the One Over Golf Club, operated by Gambino soldier Joe Pitts Canigliaro, a paraplegic gangster entrenched in loan sharking and gambling. From these hubs, Bobby managed loan shark books, gambling operations, and enforcement work that stretched across Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and especially South Brooklyn. His name became linked, sometimes in law enforcement files, sometimes in whispered street talk, to extortion, contract killings, car bombings, drug trafficking, and several unsolved gangland slayings, giving him a reputation as one of the Gambino family's most capable and dangerous hitters. Internally, Boreello's status was reflected in his formal place on the organizational chart. After John Gotti promoted his son to captain and created a crew around him, something pushed in part by Sammy Gravano, Bobby was assigned to that Gotti Jr. crew. Alongside men like John Cavallo, Charles Carneglia, and Thomas Cacciapoli, and later Dominic Fat Dom D'Ambrosio, Vincent Vinny Bucciaroni, Carmine Agnello, and Craig De Palma, Boreello emerged as the most powerful and trusted figure in the group. Associates such as Steve Kaplan, Frank Lividisi, and the Dobies brothers were funneling money from strip clubs and other ventures up the ladder, and by the late 1980s, Kaplan was paying tribute to both Bobby and Junior Gotti on strip club business running up and down the East Coast, including lucrative operations in Atlanta, Georgia. Recognizing his strength and his value, the family elevated Boreello to acting captain of Gotti Jr.'s crew, giving him authority over significant loan sharking, construction, trucking, and gambling interests that fit the traditional Gambino profile. Violence remained woven through his business. When John Gotti grew dissatisfied with Gambino soldier Louis De Bono, who had secured a lucrative contract to install fireproofing foam in the Twin Towers and was suspected of not kicking up properly, Gotti ordered the problem solved. According to later accounts, Boreello took care of De Bono, eliminating him, after which Sammy Gravano took control of the fireproofing business. A shift that created tension inside the family and underscored how killings often functioned as business decisions. At the same time, Bobby's name surfaced in federal investigative files and informant statements about the December 1985 assassination of former Gambino boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse. A Gambino informant identified him as one of the shooters in that high-profile hit, describing him as one of the family's most accomplished killers, though these accusations never resulted in a conviction. The danger of the life cut both ways. In one episode that would later prove significant, Boreello tried to kill a Genovese crime family associate named Preston Garitano on a Brooklyn street. The hit failed, and the attempt forced a delicate inter-family negotiation. The Gambinos and the Genovese sat down to decide whether Garitano would live or die. In the end, he was allowed to live, but the attempt left an open question of revenge and exposed Boreello personally to potential payback, as well as further entanglements between the families. Meanwhile, law enforcement scrutiny of Boreello was intensifying. By the time of his last months, he was the target of multiple federal agencies and the Kings County District Attorney's Office on a cocaine trafficking conspiracy case, and for his suspected role in Castellano's murder, pressure that robbed him of the relative invisibility he had enjoyed earlier in his career. The bullet that finally reached him, however, did not come from within the Gambino family, and it did not appear to be the product of Genovese retaliation, despite what John Gotti initially believed. On the street, and even in Gotti's own mind, suspicion fell on Genovese boss Vincent Chin Gigante, who had long opposed Gotti and his flashy rule. But investigators later identified the real architect of the hit as Lucchese underboss Anthony Gaspipe Casso. According to US law enforcement, Casso ordered the murder in retaliation for the killing of Lucchese member Patrick Testa, and as part of a broader strategy to squeeze the gambinos during an underworld struggle over control of New York rackets. The man who actually pulled the trigger was Frank Lastarino, a Lucchese mobster with a long history inside the family, who had been involved in extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling since the 1970s, and had risen through the Brooklyn faction under bosses like Anthony Corallo and Vittorio Musso. Lastarino, seeking promotion to consigliere, and already regarded as one of the most feared hitmen in the Lucchese organization, carried out the hit as a demonstration of loyalty and capability. Casso's reach extended deep into the New York City Police Department through detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, often referred to in later accounts as the Mafia cops. In Boreello's case, law enforcement reports state that these officers provided intelligence on his Bensonhurst address and movements, conducting surveillance that allowed Lastarino to know when and where to strike. Weeks before the shooting, a broad-shouldered NYPD detective had come alone to the Boreello family's new home, asking Susan if her husband lived there. She would later identify that detective as Eppolito after seeing his photograph on the news, a detail that sharpened the picture of how deeply compromised the NYPD had been by Casso's influence. On April 13, 1991, with the surveillance complete, Lastarino waited outside the house. As Bobby approached his Lincoln, the Lucchese gunman stepped forward and opened fire, hitting him in the head and body and leaving him fatally wounded on the pavement in front of his own home, while his family remained inside. The fallout rippled through the underworld. When John Gotti heard of Boreello's murder from his cell, he was reportedly furious. From prison, he directed Gambino representatives to meet with the Genovese leadership to determine the fate of Preston Giratano, sometimes spelled Geritano, whom the Gambinos may still have suspected as being involved or at least as a lingering problem from the earlier failed hit. At a sit-down with Genovese acting boss Liborio Bellomo, Sammy Gravano pressed for Giratano's execution in keeping with Gotti's wishes, but nothing ultimately came of the push. In a different kind of sanction, Gotti sent word back to South Brooklyn, telling Stevie Boreello that he had the boss's personal permission to avenge his brother's death, however he saw fit, and that the full weight of the Gambino family stood behind him. An unusual and potent authorization in a world where unsanctioned killings were supposed to be forbidden. In the end, Bobby Boreello's life is a compact case study in the modern mafia. A kid born into a neighborhood dominated by wise guys, pulled early into the orbit of a notorious crew, hardened through street violence and a series of arrests that never quite landed, and then elevated through formal induction, personal relationships, and a proven willingness to kill. He operated at the intersection of old-world rackets, loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and newer streams of money in strip clubs and construction contracts. He was suspected in one of the most famous mob hits of the late 20th century and directly connected to another. And he lived in a world where loyalty to a boss like Gotti could coexist with quiet resentment and internal tension over who controlled which profitable operation. His death, facilitated not only by rival mobsters but by corrupt police officers on a crime family's payroll, underscored how far the reach of organized crime extended into institutions meant to uphold the law. And the image that remains, of a career mobster cut down beside his luxury car while his wife and children sat unknowingly inside their Brooklyn home, captures the essential contradiction of that life: power and money on the street, vulnerability and collateral damage at home, and an ending that, in retrospect, feels less like a surprise than an inevitability written into the life he chose decades before. At the time of his murder, Boreello had been under investigation by multiple federal agencies and the Kings County District Attorney's Office for directing a cocaine trafficking conspiracy, as well as his suspected involvement in the murder of former family boss Paul Castellano. In fact, a Gambino informant fingered Boreello as one of the shooters in the slaying, reasoning that Boreello had been one of the more accomplished hitters in the family. When John Gotti heard about Boreello's murder, he was furious. From prison, Gotti ordered Gambino family members to meet with the leaders of the Genovese crime family, concerning the whereabouts of Preston Giratano, who the Gambinos might have suspected as Boreello's killer at the time. Keeping to their earlier agreement, they agreed to kill Giratano. Preston Giratano was a real Genovese family member and Gambino crime family associate that Boreello tried to kill on a Brooklyn street, firing shots at him in public. Salvador Gravano attended a sit-down with Genovese acting boss Liborio Bellomo, seeking Giratano's execution, but nothing ever came of it. John Gotti sent word to Stevie Boreello, giving him permission to avenge his brother's death by killing whoever he needed to, and that he had the backing of the entire Gambino family. However, it wasn't until 2004 that Giratano was stabbed to death outside a Bay Ridge, Brooklyn restaurant. Stevie Boreello would remain involved with the Gambino family after his brother's death, handling the loan sharking, gambling, and extortion rackets in Brooklyn and Staten Island, where he currently resides. Toward the year of 1994, massive indictments of labor and construction racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and murder charges were put on dozens of members of the crime family, including Lastarino, who was charged with the murder of Bartholomew Boreello and the attempted murder conspiracies on Stephen Crea and Gotti Jr., and Nicholas Carasso, as well as additional racketeering charges. Lastarino was sentenced to 20 years in prison and placed at the Fort Dix Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey.